Welcome to the Better Questions podcast. In this week, we are releasing part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Chris Keith. So if you didn't listen to part 1, you should go ahead and do that. Otherwise, part 2 is not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. But in this 2-part episode, we've been addressing the question, are the Gospels historically accurate? And so in part 1, we spent a lot of time talking about why is that maybe not the most helpful question? And here in part 2, we're going to start getting more into how then should we view the Gospels? And how should we read the Gospels? So here's the conclusion to our conversation with Dr. Chris Keith. How is that supposed to impact the way that we read the Gospels when we come together as a faith community to read them?
Well, I think one thing is to say that despite what I just said, I don't think it's illegitimate to ask historical questions. I've written several books that ask and try to answer historical questions. But I think that the starting point is not, did this or did this not happen? The starting point is saying, why might they have thought this? And if you start there, then you have to start speculating in the best way possible, using your historical imagination, the various reasons they might have thought these things. Working through those proposed scenarios is how you can actually start making historical decisions. And there's no template to proving that something did or didn't happen. And like I said earlier, I think there's an awful lot in the Gospels that we can't possibly hope to get answers to. And then there are other things. I use the example of the Matthean zombies, which I don't think that really ever happened in real life, and I don't know any gospel scholars who do. But but if you're playing the zero-sum game, then what you say is that tells us nothing about the historical Jesus. And I think that I completely reject that idea. Because what it tells us is that already in the first century, whoever Matthew was, thought Jesus was, they thought that he kick-started the resurrection in some way that led to the resurrection of other people. And whether anybody accepts the resurrection or the claim of those restricted resurrections to be historically accurate, the very fact that they thought that, they claimed it, is a historical piece of evidence that we can investigate. Because we can say, well, why did they think that? And for me, part of the reason is they probably believed in Jesus' resurrection, but they also believed that he was the promised Messiah who was going to kickstart the end times. And so then you start asking, why did they think that? All right, and and then you can actually start answering questions about, what would have made them thought that? So I would come out the other end of that process saying, no, I don't actually think that people came up out of tombs at Jesus' crucifixion and were seen walking around Jerusalem. And we have one person who attests to that, one historical source about it. I mean, if that actually happened, then we'd have a lot more about that. But I do think the fact that they claim it tells us a whole lot about who they thought Jesus was, right? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
So in other words, instead of, the traditional scholarly thing is to take that piece of tradition and just throw it out like, that's just early Christian belief. But all we have is early Christian belief. It's not like we have something else. That's what we have. So the question isn't, is this early Christian belief? The answer to that question is easy. It is. The question is, why did they believe that instead of believing something else? I mean, there's a historical Jesus scholar named Dale Allison that's got a fantastic piece on the Matthean zombies. And he articulates in a much better way what I kind of just said now. The fact that it didn't happen doesn't mean it tells us nothing historically. It tells us a lot historically.
Right. And I have a follow-up question that's probably rather simple, but to get to it, I want to give a specific example. Because recently I've had a couple conversations with people that headed this direction, and I've tried to communicate that, well, there's certain events in the gospel specifically, and really in all of Scripture, that I kind of have said to them that I don't really think it matters ultimately whether or not it really happened, because I see all this depth in, seeing it from a different angle. For instance, when in Matthew it talks about there being like a bounty on all of the babies' heads, which is kind of a nod to Exodus, the Exodus story. So where do they flee to? Well, they flee to Egypt, and then Jesus comes back from Egypt to Israel and to Nazareth. And when I show that to people, I go, well, doesn't that really make sense that if Matthew's purpose is to write to the Jews, that he would give Jesus an experience that mirrors what the Israelite people went through in the Exodus story? And when they see that, they're not really as mind-blown as I was when I first discovered that. They're more just hung up on the fact that I'm saying that maybe that didn't really happen. And so my simple question is, how do we have better conversations with people that, these kind of ideas are that are perceived as threats to their whole worldview, their whole biblical view? And how can we approach that with people in a grace-filled way where we end up leaving still friends and still mutual respect? And, can you speak to that a little bit?
I can speak to what it looks like when it all blows up. Well, in reality, from that experience, I don't know if Chris told you anything. I mean, I carry deep wounds from that whole experience because I felt very mischaracterized and all that. And when I walked away from that table, I certainly didn't feel like I'd been dealt with, and my colleague had not been dealt with in a grace-filled way. It's a multifaceted answer to your question. One is, I think that for the people who get it, you have to deal with people who don't in a pastoral way. And a lot of times we think we're just going to open this truth bomb and drop it on them, and all of a sudden they're going to see it. And usually that's not actually what's happening. Usually they've been raised often to believe that this is the only thing that matters, is whether XYZ thing really happened. And so for them, they're not actually making a decision about whether Jesus really went down to Egypt or not. They're making a decision about whether they're going to fit in their family anymore, they're going to fit in their faith community anymore, whether they're going to be viewed as a heretic for saying this thing. And so one of the things to say is, hey, look, it's okay. It's all right. There are many people who have thought these things throughout the long history of following Jesus, and they knew these things a long, long time ago. Origen, Augustine are talking about what we would call historical Jesus issues in the 3rd century and the 4th century. These questions are, if I'm right about the Gospel of John, he's having this conversation at the end of the 1st century. So this whole idea of asking these questions is part of the history of the church. It's not some, counter-op, by which you undermine it. It's part of it. The other thing is that I think that people a lot of times, you can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of times they're not responding to what we would call facts. They're responding to people's personalities, their own and the person that they're disagreeing with. So I have found through trial and error often that the way that you have conversations like this that are meaningful, where you walk away friends, is when they come to you. Is when people come and say, you know what, I don't know if I can buy that anymore. Or I don't know that it matters in the way that it used to. And you say, yeah, I've been there for a while. Do you want, it's all right. And so again, kind of dealing with it pastorally. I will say one thing that complicates it is that the earliest followers of Jesus, they did care about whether things really did happen. I mean, Paul says, if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, we're to be pitied among all men. And Paul, and whatever somebody does with the resurrection, I at least historically am really convinced they believed it. They didn't think they were hallucinating. They didn't think it was a group hallucination. They didn't think that. They didn't mean what we would say when we'd say, like, my grandma's with me in spirit. That's not what they were talking about. They really believed it. Now, does that prove that it's true? No more than, the people, people die for things they believe in all the time. But they did think it, all right? And Paul believed in it. He believed it was something very different than what we often think of. But, what I'm trying to say is the whole idea of asking the question, well, did this really happen? That has a place. The earliest followers of Jesus do care about that. What's difficult is they don't always care about it the way that we do. And what they did with their convictions was not always what we do. It's absolutely infuriating to see people willing to fight and lose Christian fellowship over whether you believe that, Jesus could read or write, when you've got, people starving to death in your city.
Right.
So it's kind of, it's the thing that the reason it has to be confronted is because people confuse this with the gospel itself. I mean, the gospel is the proclamation that Jesus is Lord, right? Right. The gospel is not and never was inspiration means this particular thing. The gospel is not and never was Jesus really did go down to Egypt. It's just not. The early church fought over a whole lot of things, but they didn't fight over those things.
Well, that question there, we wanted to talk about unity, and I'd love to then ask a question to end us on this idea of action. So I think this would probably be a really bad question to ask if I was in a camp of historical Jesus scholars, but I'm a pastor. So I guess my question is, when we look at some of these questions we've been talking about, when we come to the text, I feel like even if I could say, well, here's the proof that here's exactly how it happened, it still doesn't really mean anything at that point if it doesn't change the way I live, if it doesn't call me to any sort of action. Like, that's a really boring sermon. That's just, here's the proof that this happened, the end. So as we're coming to the Gospels and these stories and asking these types of questions, what do you think is the process for uncovering what are these trying to say to us as far as the action and the response that it's calling us to?
Well, it brings up a point that we talked about earlier. The text isn't trying, with a few exceptions, the gospel texts are not trying to move you to a point of affirming that XYZ thing happened in space and time. They're explicitly trying to move you to the point to say that Jesus is this person. This is who Jesus is. That's what it's about. Is how people answer the question of who Jesus is. And that is what, within the faith community, or at least within the Christian faith community, that is what should be the draw toward action. Because this whole dichotomy of only affirmations that X thing has historically happened is what should motivate you, that's just not true. I know a whole bunch of people who believe that will take a hardline position on every event in historical Jesus' life, and they're a-holes, and nobody follows them, right? And I know people who don't believe any of it. I mean, one of the best preachers I've ever heard was a historical Jesus scholar by the name of John Dominic Crossan, who would take, compared to conservative Christians, would take liberal perspectives, almost every time, but he had a really strong sense of what it meant. What was, the whole idea that it had to have happened to be compelling, there's a ton in the Bible that we don't know whether it happened, and it's not exactly clear whether we're supposed to think that it happened. Did Jonah really happen? How do you determine whether I'm not talking about whether somebody's willing to believe that it happened. That can be answered. But did the author of that text expect you to believe that it happened? There are a lot of texts in the Bible where you can say the author expects you to believe that XYZ thing happened. The authors of the Gospels really do want you to believe that there was a crucifixion and Jesus really did die, right? Did the author of Jonah really expect you to believe that Jonah actually happened in space and time? I don't know. I genuinely don't. I have no idea how to answer that question. So how could we possibly, but can it still be compelling? Yes. I mean, to take a really simplistic example, when Nathan told David the parable of the lamb, did that happen in space and time? No. But was it supposed to be compelling to David? Yeah. There's a whole lot. And I mean, what really conservative people hear when you say that is, well, you're just saying that it's just a story. And my response is, what do you mean just a story? It's a story that continues to move billions of people in the world today.
Yep.
Furthermore, it's not like this is unique to faith. You know, we started out this conversation talking about the Godfather. There are a lot of things that didn't happen in space and time that I find compelling, that I think, yeah, that moves me. So I think one way, Chris, that I would answer your question is to say that, you know, particularly within the church community, to try to focus on the idea that what's compelling is not whether XYZ thing happened, but who Jesus is, who Jesus was, you know, and people will say, well, you can't answer one without the other, and that's just nonsense. Yeah, you can. You don't want to, because that's not how you were raised, but you can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
What do you think of that?
I mean, I have been saying for a long time, like, that, you know, one, stories can build kingdoms and tear them down. Like, stories unite humanity. And two, that story was one of the primary vehicles through which Jesus taught. And if Jesus is God, which I think he is, we somehow, like, are not willing to accept the idea that God would also, through inspiring the Old Testament scriptures to be written, would also teach through parable. Like, we're not even willing to open the door to Jonah maybe being a parable, or some of the early chapters of Genesis not literally happening as history. But, well, God wouldn't teach us through parables that way, because that has to have really happened, or the Bible doesn't make any sense, and we should just throw it all out. Oh, but when God became flesh and dwelt among us, of course he taught in parables, because that's just how Jesus was, you know? And it's like,
no one said the parable of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son was just a story.
Right, exactly.
Well, there's what you're, I think, unless I've misunderstood you, observing too, is there continues to be this remnant that the real barometer of truth is whether I can stick it in a lab and repeat it. You know, whether I can prove that this actually really happened, that this is, and again, this is just fundamentally an egocentric approach to truth. And furthermore, it gets applied in ways that are really suspicious. You know, that I really want, you know, that Christians will say, what really matters is that, you know, when the text says that Jesus went down to Egypt and came back as a child, that if you say that didn't happen, you're just not a real Christian. And you turn around and say, well, okay, let's talk about in Judges the raping and mutilation of a Levite's concubine.
Yeah.
Did that really happen? Does that compel you? How does that move you? Or how about when God issues decrees that the Israelites commit genocide? How important is it that really happened? And does that move you? You know, what's happening is that people take a handful of texts that become some type of litmus test. And it's a litmus test to them because it was a litmus test in the context they grew up in often. And the fundamental problem here is that as far as the New Testament authors are concerned, that was never the litmus test that mattered. It wasn't even a litmus test in that way at all. Yep. And so somehow this, and there's, you know, I hate to get preachy, but there's a word for when you let something else get, when you start worshiping something other than God himself, and that's idolatry. So when you start saying my view of inspiration is actually the true litmus test of salvation, no, it's not. Where? Show me that anywhere in the text. If you care about the text, show me anywhere in the text where that happens. It's idolatrous. In the very least, it's bibliolatry, but it's idolatrous.
I think for me, I would wonder if you think it's fair to say, though, that maybe the pendulum is somewhere kind of in the middle, because at the same time, I guess my struggle with some of this is if you're saying the point of the Gospels is how do you respond to Jesus? Who is Jesus? If we're called to look like Jesus and to follow Jesus, I mean, does it not kind of matter that we actually have a semi-accurate picture of who Jesus was and what he cared about and what he did? And I guess my question is there a pendulum somewhere in the middle where it's like, well, it's also not just like the authors of the Gospels were just going rogue and being like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we wrote that Jesus did this? Wouldn't it be cool if we made up this story? That maybe there's something in the middle there?
Let me ask two questions for you, because those are astute observations. One is, what if they were going rogue and making stuff up? And two, you said that there should be at least some semi-accurate information about here. I can't remember how you phrased it, but you used the word accuracy. Let's assume we say yes. There needs to be some accurate information in there, right? Who determines what counts as accurate?
I don't know.
See what's happening in the discussion is that one group of people has an unstated, sometimes stated, but often unstated definition of what counts as accuracy.
So I guess for me, though, when I'm saying accuracy, and I already know what you're going to tell me, but I'm going to ask it anyways. When I'm talking about accuracy, I actually mean less did this happen the way everyone else did. So I would agree with you. The story in Matthew about all these dead people coming back to life, that probably didn't actually happen in space and time. But I do think that the author of Matthew is trying to communicate that this is the kind of new life and the kind of resurrection that Jesus has initiated through what has just happened.
It's a claim for the first fruits of the resurrection. I mean, yeah. what Paul calls first fruits.
And so my thing for accuracy would be more that like that is actually true. That now, can we ever actually know that? Well, I guess not. Like that's why it's called faith. But I guess that's more what I'm saying is that we actually have a picture of what the significance of Jesus is, or like what Jesus cared about, or the types of things that were important to Jesus is more what I mean by an accurate picture than that all of these events literally happened.
What do you think I'm going to say?
Well, I guess again,
how do you determine whether that's accurate? I mean, whether that really, I mean, what you said is all that you can say. I mean, that's a statement of faith. You know, Paul says we know now in part, we'll then know in full. I mean, most of the early followers of Jesus, they knew that there were a lot of untied bows, you know, that everything wasn't wrapped up with a nice little bow on top. And, you know, that if the earliest accounts of the first century Jesus followers are to be believed, I think that the very earliest of his followers, the closest of his followers, would necessarily have concluded that he was not who they thought he was initially. That's why they're huddled in a room. That's why they don't believe initially. That's why in the literature it takes Jesus showing them his body and eating with them to convince them, is because they believe. I mean, the crucifixion was necessarily a statement that Jesus lost. It would have taken something powerful to make them change their tune on that. And so that's one way to get into the question about the resurrection is you know, I mean, the least we can say is that it would have taken an event like that, or, you know, yeah, could they have had some type of mass deception or something like that? Absolutely. That that could have happened. How do we prove that one way or another? There's no test to run on that. And similarly to the question that you're asking, whether, do we know, let's say that we shift saying, within a community of faith, let's shift to saying what really matters is not whether XYZ thing happened, but whether Jesus is who he says he is. Right? This is where the people, our detractors, I'm going to say but they actually have a leg to stand on, because can you answer that question without necessarily assuming the answer to some historical questions? Yeah, that's the case. I don't think that for people who want to claim to be Christians, you don't escape answering some historical questions. It's not the case that it's just all story and all the truth is in story. What is the case is you have no access to it other than story. Right? There is no history without interpretation. And similarly, the statement about if we shift from saying that what really matters not whether XYZ happened, but whether Jesus is who they say he is, whether that is accurate. How do you measure that?
Right.
You measure it with your life. Within the church community, that's the answer. But whether it's true, you have students who say, I have students who would say, well, I know it's true because I know it in my heart. I know what's inside of me. I know what happened to me, and you can't know it if you didn't have it. I distinctly remember it was at Lincoln. I had a student, and I said, do you believe in alien abductions? He said, no. And I said, well, why wouldn't you? Because that's the exact explanation that people who claim to have been abducted by aliens give. I know what happened to me. I know what I experienced, and you don't understand it because you haven't experienced it. And the issue is that one of those things appears radical and one of them appears normal because one of them's been normalized within a faith community. Actually, the other one's been normalized within a faith community as well. They're just a minority community, even more minority than Christians. But the thing is, yes, you can appeal to that, and I'm not saying that it doesn't matter for anything. But I am saying that how you answer the question of whether that's ultimately true, I don't personally think. There are people who claim to have had experiences of God. I would love to have one. I've never had one, but I'm open to being just proven wrong on it. But I just don't think for the vast majority of us, certainly in the Western world where we tend to be anti-supernatural, even within a community that claims to believe in the supernatural, I just don't know that you get answers on this side. What do you think? How does that sit with you, Chris?
I can't.
We want them.
Yeah.
We want them.
Yeah. I don't know how I would say it sits with me, but I agree. I don't have any pushback that I can give to that.
Well, I think I've had many students and people I've talked to, they really don't like that. But I can tell you a lot of times when we talk to broken people, particularly within the faith community, and they know that life isn't exactly like that anyway, that kind of resonates with them because they know that uncertainty is just part of life in general. So I don't know why it's a sham for us to think that uncertainty is not going to be part of the faith aspect of life as well. It always has been. Job is in the canon for a reason. The Ecclesiastes is in the canon for a reason. Lament Psalms are in the canon for a reason. There are many, those texts, what they proclaim very loudly is that part of the faith experience is not getting answers to the questions that you ask.
Absolutely. Yeah, for a long time, I've been thinking how just this idea of certainty really bucks up against faith, like you're talking about. And a lot of times we say that faith and doubt are so at odds, and doubt is the opposite of faith. When really, in a lot of ways, I feel like our own scriptures point to us to the fact that actually a lot of our like heroes of the faith struggled with doubt immensely. And it might point to the fact that maybe the opposite of faith is actually certainty, to some degree. And, and maybe some might say, well, isn't uncertainty and doubt the same thing? And I feel like, no, and it's in defining what each of those things are that we can start to help see how we're supposed to actually live out, where we can still be a person of faith, even though we're carrying some doubts through the way we live, and how maybe too much certainty can actually make us look more like Pharisees and end up hindering our witness or keeping us from actually living out our faith in a really real, authentic way because we just feel like we already have it all figured out.
Yeah. Yeah, I probably wouldn't use Pharisees in that way. I mean, Pharisees, if you look at what Josephus says about them, what you mean is some of the negative portrayals of Jesus' enemies, I think.
Right.
But your point about doubt, just on a personal level, I don't trust people who say they don't doubt. I mean, there are a lot of kind of apologists and stuff like that. They're 100% certain this definitely happened, and I think you are like people. Like in the ancient world, people didn't come back to life any more regularly they do in our world. It was a crazy claiming that Jesus was resurrected. It was crazy then. And the people who proclaimed it knew it was crazy when they were proclaiming it. So I just had this conversation with a friend of mine who wanted to meet with me. He said, I've always wondered really what you think about this. I said, of course, it's a crazy statement. If you don't think it was a crazy statement, I don't think you understand what they're actually claiming. So it's only natural that you'd sit back and say, well, I have questions about some of these. I mean, if somebody doesn't have any questions at all about that, I don't know. I wouldn't let them do my taxes.
I mean, for me, it just, I feel like the reality in which we find ourselves when it comes to the history of the Bible or the Gospels, like actually might be the best one, because when I think about my life, the ways in which I've grown the most is when I've been thrown into a situation where like I was in the dark or didn't know exactly what all I was doing, or I was doubtful. And that opened up avenues for me to grow and test myself. Whereas I think about times where I was completely comfortable and knew everything, like that's how you become bored and stagnant. And maybe this is the better option. I don't know.
Yeah, well, whether it's better or not, you have to face the reality of
right.
the text that we have, not the text that you want it to be.
Yep.
And that's the thing that I think that bothers me the most is when people, this is probably the Chris Keith who grew up in a conservative context and little pieces of that never left. I really don't like people. I like it when people twist the text to make it say something that it doesn't say. And the worst perpetrators of this are people who often say they care about the text most loudly. Because they really, really want the text to align with exactly what they say. So you get people saying stuff like, well, the text doesn't have any contradictions in it. Well, then you're not really reading the text. You can shout from the rooftops that you really care about the Bible, but if you're not willing to actually deal with the text that, from your perspective, God gave us, if it was good enough for Him, why is it not good enough for you? So one of the things that I think that's really necessary is to say, the text that we have is the one that not only we have to deal with, but the one that we get to deal with.
Yeah, that's great.
When I worked with Chris at a couple different churches, anytime it was just us in a room, this is pretty much where the conversation went for like 2 or 3 hours.
Well, there's most definitely a generational shift in approaches to the Bible within the Christian community, within the conservative. What we're really talking about is white Christian community, and And the comforting or encouraging thing for me as somebody who interprets the Bible for a living is that it's people that have become a lot more comfortable with acknowledging that, it quite clearly, lo and behold, it didn't actually fall out of the sky. And so
Right.
What does that actually look like? And a lot of times I have to tell people, they're really, they found out that, they're these explicit contradictions or something, and they're really disheartened. And it's kind of like, look, they've been there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and people knew that they were there. What's changed is what you learned. The text has not changed at all. Well, I mean, the text obviously changed over time, but my point is, that it was always like that. So I think that there's most definitely something happening in terms of people becoming more and more comfortable with less rigorous, historically positivist views of the biblical text.
Well, all those conversations, Andrew, are mostly his fault.
Yeah. Well, I think that the people who really have trouble and want to avoid these conversations need to ask themselves very, very seriously whether they actually care about the text. And that's the difficult thing, and that's why you asked the question earlier about unity and grace, Chris. And I think the hard reality is that sometimes it's not there to be had. Some people don't. If someone's coming from a perspective that all that really matters is whether you agree with me on X thing, and don't get me wrong, people can be sticklers and jerks on both sides of this. It's not like there's one of them has the market. But it was the hard reality that I faced, Chris, when I stopped teaching there, was that battle was not going to be won. I was never going to win those people over to seeing that I actually did care about the text. I actually did care about Jesus. They were playing through their framework, and they weren't interested in hearing anything else. And sometimes the most gracious thing that you can do for the sake of unity, whether it's with believers or non-believers, is just to walk away and say, I don't need you to affirm what I think in order for me to have a perfectly healthy conscience about why I think it. Which is a really nice way of saying I really don't care what you think. But there is a proper way to say that. I don't need you to affirm what I think in order for us to both be, say, brothers and sisters in Christ. If you're upset about it, that's your problem. It's okay.
Yep. Well, if people want to find more of your work, where can they go?
Oh, they'll be bored to death. It's all on Amazon, or they could go to my faculty page, or they could just send me an email.
What are you working on? Anything new coming up?
I have a book going to Oxford University Press here, hopefully before this week is out, which I realize we only have 2 more days in this week. So, but it's called The Gospel as Manuscript, and it's on the role that the Jesus tradition as material artifact played, specifically in 2 phenomena. The first is what I call the competitive textualization of the Jesus tradition. And then the second one is on the public reading of the Gospels in early Christian assemblies, early Christ assemblies. And then after that, I have a book with Yale University Press on the role of the Gospel of John in the quest for the historical Jesus. So back to the historical Jesus after that.
Considering the conversation that we've had today, are there any other particularly maybe more accessible resources you would recommend for people that want to dive more into what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, in terms of what I've written, I do have Jesus Against the Scribal Elite is probably the most accessible book that I've written. It's written as almost a textbook, and it should be accessible to someone who's a lay reader, but an interested lay reader. It's written in a way that it also would bore a lot of lay readers to death, But it's about the question that it asks is basically how did Jesus become important in the first place? In other words, scholars tend to just assume that Jesus had these controversies with other teachers, and this book deals with the question of why did they have a problem with Jesus? Like, why didn't they just dismiss him and say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about? Why did they care what he thought about in the first place? And it deals with that. And I end up arguing actually that a lot of scholars doubt whether these controversies between Jesus and other Jewish teachers ever happened. I actually think there's a very strong case to be made that they did, and that the main reason was that they regarded him kind of as an illegitimate teacher, that he was out of his league, and they were trying to show him up, and so there was just constant kind of bashing heads over whether he actually had the authority to be saying the kinds of things that he was saying. So that's probably the most accessible thing that people would be able to get their hands on. Jesus against the scribal elite.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for taking time to chat with us. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys, and thanks for the ministry that you're doing with this podcast, and good luck with the rest of your conversations, and tell Larry Hurtado hello from me.
Will do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it. It's nice to meet you
Awesome.
guys. Chris, it's good to see you again.
You too. Thanks.
All right, bye.
Well, you just got done listening to the Better Questions podcast, otherwise known as Chris sucking up to his teacher. So if you want to see more of that, click subscribe below or follow us on our Facebook page, join us on Patreon. Yeah, and if you liked the episode, a great way to get more people to listen and watch is to just share the video on any social media or on Facebook, because the more you share that, the more ears and eyes get on there. And we have upgraded to video, so next, Laserdisc. Woo! Be on the lookout for that.
Thanks so much. And as always, keep asking better questions that call you to action and that bring unity to all perspectives.